I'd like to welcome to the JPP, the Jewish Philanthropy Podcast, President Richard M. Joel. President Joel is well known to our community. He was the fourth president of Yeshiva, of YU. He's written on topics that include Jewish leadership, the BDS movement on college campuses, and civil discourse. He's currently a professor at YU, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit. He received his BA and his JD, his law degree, from NYU, where he was a Root Tilden Law Scholar. He received honorary doctorates from Boston Hebrew College and Gratz College. My grandmother was a graduate of Gratz College. He was also, early in his career, an assistant district attorney. I'm a former attorney myself, so I'm looking forward to talking about some of this background. Was an assistant district attorney, deputy chief of appeals in the Bronx, and he also was associate dean and professor of law at the Benjamin Cardozo School of Law. Preceding his tenure as president of Yeshiva, he also, for 14 years, was the president and international director of Hillel, the Foundation for Jewish Campus Life, an amazing organization where in each of his stints professionally made a tremendous impact, and currently is the president emeritus of Yeshiva University. President Joel, it's a great honor to have you here this morning on the podcast. Thank you for making the time.
Well, thank you for coming. That was such a nice introduction. You should say it again.
Your mother would like it, right?
She certainly would. May she rest in peace.
Okay. So I always open up by asking my guests just to share a little bit in their own words. I just, articulated a resume, but I'd love to hear a little bit in your own words, how you perceive yourself. How do you see yourself?
I'm a very fortunate individual. I think there might be people as fortunate as I. I can't imagine anyone more fortunate. And that's a great blessing for which I thank God on a regular basis. I'm a guy. I'm a husband married to my best friend for 50 years, which is very incongruous since I think I'm about 52. And we have 6 delicious children, 5 children-in-law, Blia and Hara, so far 18 grandchildren.
Wow.
I'm a proud Jew and Zionist and American, and thank God I've had the opportunity to try to make it better.
I appreciate the gratitude. That's a wonderful, wonderful quality. And it's always inspiring to see people who are grateful for the things that they've been able to do in the world. So thank you for sharing that. And of course, we don't come from nowhere. So let's talk a little bit about your upbringing. I think I had heard you mention that maybe you grew up in South Africa for a brief period of time. I'd love to hear a little bit about your parents, about your upbringing, etc.
I was, I think, like a poster boy for mid-20th century upbringing. I had 2 wonderful parents. I'm an only child. I grew up in Yonkers, New York. My father was from Poland and then from Vilna and then South Africa. So we spent almost a year when I was 6 living in Cape Town. My father had a very good life there, and there was the question as to whether that might be someplace where we should live. And Baruch Hashem, thank God, my parents decided that South Africa was not a healthy place to raise living human beings. So we were back in New York. There was not an outstanding yeshiva in Yonkers when I was growing up. So I went to Talmud Torah in Yonkers. I had 2 teachers who would tutor me. And when I got to, excuse me, when I finished 8th grade, I went to Yeshiva University High School, where I had a fine education, and I learned to love Yiddishkeit, but I'm not sure I learned to love the Jews I was in school with. So that I was a little boy living with his mother, who never really escaped the bubble. And then I came to YU high school thinking I would get, fill out my Jewish being. And it wasn't a terribly happy time for me. It did give me some encouragement to promise that if I ever had the opportunity, I'd improve that school. And Baruch Hashem, I think I had that opportunity. My mother was born in the Bronx. My father was a man of the world, and we had a very fine 1950s modern Orthodox upbringing. There were no Teanex or communities like that. We lived in Yonkers. We had We davened in a lovely Orthodox shul called Congregation Sons of Israel. I was very close to the Rav there and the Chazan there. I was part of a Yomim Noraim choir from the time I was 9 till I got
Yeah,
married.
you're a big Baal Tefillah, I forgot. Okay.
Not a big, it's just about this high. That year in South Africa was important to me. When I was 12, my parents took me on the grand tour of Europe for a month, which was a very wonderful experience. And then my dad passed away when I was 13. And as they say, the music died. I had an incredible mother who insisted that the lesson I learned from my father's death is not about his death, but about his life. I think I learned the lesson that every day has to be savored. And I have a Snoopy cartoon that our kids gave us that has Snoopy turning to Charlie Brown, and he says, we only live once. And Charlie Brown turns to him and says, no, you're wrong, right? We only die once. We live every day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that meant a lot to me. I was involved during my high school years in a synagogue youth group, which I was kind of the informal head of in Yonkers. And I enjoyed my undergraduate education. I went to NYU. It was then a different campus. It was in the Bronx. It was lovely. And it was one of the first Danforth-funded educations that were interdisciplinary in nature. So I got my degree in the Metropolitan Leadership Program in something called National Priorities. It was a wonderful experience. Toward the end of my years, I became involved in Yeshiva University's youth programs, Torah Leadership Seminar. Frankly, because I met a girl at a Shabbaton, I didn't have the nerve to ask her out. And as she left, she told me, I really ought to try coming to Torah Leadership Seminar as an advisor. She left. I moped for 3 days. I had enough chutzpah to go to YU and asked if they had any needs. Actually, it's an interesting lesson somehow. I said, do you have any needs for advisors? The fellow who was in charge said no. I turned around, started leaving, and he said, wait a minute. He said, do you do anything? I said, I beg your pardon? He said, well, do you have any skills or talents? Do you play an instrument? Do you sing? I said, well, I play the accordion and I sing a little bit. And the fellow turned to me and he said, sing to me. So I guess in the most important song of my life, I said, Torah, 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 Tziva Lanu Moshe. He said, I'll take a chance on you. I came to the seminar. I saw this girl who had motivated me to come. She was standing in a corner. I went over to say hello. She looked right through me as if I wasn't there. And she said she had a tough summer at Camp Marasha, and she went home. So I was somehow placed in this environment where I was very fortunate and was asked to head their next program. And I was introduced to the new girls' head, and it was that woman. And thank God, it's 6 children and 50 years later.
I want to ask you, thank you for sharing that. I want to ask you just a little bit in terms of being an only child, right? It's not something one chooses, but how do you think that impacted you? I'm sure in some ways very positively and maybe in other ways negatively.
Yeah, it's hard to distinguish being an only child from being an only child whose father died. I don't know how much of who I am is as a result of that. I'd like to think it was about his life and not about his death, but certainly it has some impact. The truth is, until I was older, like had children, I didn't know I was lonely. And in fact, I would talk to Esther and I'd say, I don't know how I can have multiple children. How can you possibly give the love to multiple children that my folks gave to me? So I learned, of course you can. It was very family centered. We had my mother had a small family, and we would get together with my grandparents and aunts and uncles on a regular basis. Learned there were more friends and family in South Africa and different places in the world, and that was nice. It was hard after he died. It was a very hard time seeing my mother so unhappy. I think it also it made me differently sensitive than other people because the average 14-year-old only has a certain bandwidth of sensitivity. The greatest pleasure and the worst pain is not that far apart. So once you've been down in the valley, you also get to appreciate the the hills and the view so much. Only child was it made me very close to my parents, who were very invested as I had friends, but not a ton, because you were living in a community where most people around you didn't follow the same pattern. So I had some Jewish friends, some non-Jewish friends. They knew me as the kid who couldn't eat in their home. But thank God I have nothing but positives about my upbringing. I think it informed who I was. Sometimes I play the game of saying, well, had none of those things happened, would I still be the same person? And I hope to say that I would be, but certainly you're influenced, I think, Latov, by all of that.
Right. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I'd love to hear a little bit about your pursuit of the law, kind of what inspired you to initially move in that direction professionally.
But if you're serious about your Yiddishkeit, even as a child, you realize that your life is defined by law. If you're not fortunate, you say it's defined by rules. If you're fortunate, you say it's defined by law, a compact either between people or between man and God, that if you live by a certain code, your life can be as full as it can possibly be, and as a human being, you can matter. So as a child of the 50s, I think all of us, I'm 73. So for me, when I thought of career, my father was in business, but he died young again. It was, am I going to be a lawyer? Am I going to be a doctor? Am I going to be a rabbi? Or am I going to be a business person, but hardly thought about business person? And it was all in the context of, so I'd like to be part of the community. I'd like to try to make a difference. And I thought it was law. I would like to tell you that I thought much more deeply about that, but I think my peers and I didn't give much of we assumed we'd make a living. I didn't come from a wealthy family, but a middle-class family, but we assumed we'd make a living. I didn't love blood, and so medicine was not it. I thought there was an order, a nobility to law. I felt that until I got to law school.
Interesting. I mean, even growing up, say 20 years after you in the 70s, it was still very much medicine, law, rabbi. Today it's very different, but it's interesting.
Yes, yes. And the truth is, I gave it almost no thought. And I wanted to fix the world. I got to law school and came up with and law school was different in the 70s. It was a colder place, and it was a more absolutist place, and the divisions were harsher. But I didn't see a lot about fixing the world in law school. Unless you chose one specific path. It was about how you're going to make money, and it didn't resonate properly. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. It's wonderful to be able to do that. One day I hope to have a grandchild who can make some money, because the children won't. And I was, because I was a Ruth Tilden scholar, which is how NYU tried to get quote top students. They made a mistake with me. I was given an internship in the district attorney's office, and I found a venue, although a difficult one, where law and justice mattered, and where you could make a difference, particularly in the 70s. I mean, I started my career as an assistant DA in the Bronx, and the Bronx was on fire in the 70s. All of New York was. This year, there is something like 400 homicides in the city of New York every year. In 1976, there were over 400 in the Bronx.
Wow. Okay.
So I did that. I didn't think, but the other thing that, I always give people advice is, don't be like me. I did nothing in terms of career planning, ever. I don't think I've ever applied for a job. And I enjoyed being an assistant district attorney, even though it was very painful. And I didn't think much about what was next. I assumed it would be the next steps in law. But as they say in Latin, Mensch tracht und Gott lacht.
Right.
Man proposes and God disposes.
Right. God laughs. Right. So so interesting. So how long were you in the legal space post law school?
Well, I was in the practice space for 4 years.
Okay.
I became associate dean and professor of law at Cardozo So I was there for another 8 or 9 years.
Wow. Okay.
Basically, I was the dean's pooper scooper. I was the COO of the law school,
Got it.
and I dealt with everything except faculty matters. I was named a professor of law without tenure, and they asked me to teach. I taught originally legal writing, but eventually they knew that my passion was ethics. So once a year, one semester a year, I would teach the course in professional responsibility. So when you say how long was I in law, I mean, it lasted for a while. And those were also good years. And I think one of the reasons I did it is I always had this sense of Yeshiva University being a shining city on a hill. And the chance to be a part of that and to be part of the university administration, I thought was a wonderful thing.
I can't resist, so I'm going to stick this in right now. And I mentioned it to my students this past semester at Sci Sims. One of my favorite mantras of yours was that you would often share that one of the unique qualities of Yeshiva University, I want to make sure I'm saying it correctly, is you'd often say that the next Nobel laureate is not coming from Lakewood, and the next big Rosh Yeshiva is probably not coming from Harvard, but they both may be sitting in Yeshiva University, something like that.
You have a frightening memory. I was speaking at a gathering
but I love that. That's a brilliant insight.
But and I wasn't trying to put down either. I just they were considering different things. I said, there's no place like Yeshiva University.
This was a question on my final exam. What did I teach you that President Richard Joel?
Oh, that's so funny.
Yes.
Yeah. Look, the point is whether it's Rosh Yeshiva or whether it's Nobel laureate, the whole notion that life can't be put on two tracks. That for us, this is the opportunity, particularly at a place like YU, to develop yourself. Dr. Lamb spoke about synthesis. Right. And Dr. Belkin spoke about harmony, and the Rav talked about Torah Umada in a complex way. When I became president, Rabbi Tendler, may he rest in peace, came to me and said, "I heard you say Torah Umada l'chatchila, that it's not an excuse, it's a priori kind of sense." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Never stop saying that." So I think it's a very important reality. And I think in a world where there's enough that you can be neurotic about, it shouldn't be about who you are.
Right. So it's beautiful. So we have deep-seated YU roots, both in the MTA days as well as in the Cardoza days. Now, if I'm figuring this pathway correctly, you're probably in your late 30s, close to 40, and presumably an opportunity presented itself to you to somehow pivot and transition from the legal world, professorial world, to Hillel. So I'd love to hear about how that came about, what your thinking was in terms of that transition.
We lived in Oceanside. At that point, we had 5 kids. We had a wonderfully happy life. For 11 years, I was the youth director in Young Israel of Oceanside.
Rabbi Blech was your rabbi.
Rabbi Blech was my Moradasra, yes.
Okay, and he was my congregant on the Upper West Side. So much better to have him as your rabbi than your congregant. But no,
we both have wonderful stories, we can tell. Yeah. But we were very close, our families, and Oceanside was a great place, but at a certain point, you can't be a youth director anymore, although one would argue that that's what I did for my entire life. Okay. But as associate dean at Cardozo, it was very meaningful, but I was getting older. I thought about what was next. I wasn't thrilled with going the route of law firm, not because there's anything wrong with it, but there was always this little voice saying, is this all there is? Am I supposed to do more? And I got a lot of that from being a dean and being a professor and being involved in the university. But I was 37, 38, and had started the process. It would be nice to feed the family too. So I started the process of talking to people about jobs. I thought for a minute about whether there was something in the Jewish community, and a few people who were wonderful mentors to me said, yes, it's called lay leadership. And the rest of the stuff, there's nothing there for you, which was fine. I was about to finalize a position with a Wall Street level firm who were happy to have me, not because I was great, but because I had the title dean and professor. And they thought I guess they thought I could bring in business. When I got a cold call from someone who I had known, who told me that there was a position open as the head of Hillel, and they thought I should apply for it. I said, thanks very much, but I, never had anything to do with that. Said, well, I think you should come for an interview. I said, I'm not a rabbi. He said, well, that would be, they're happy to not have a rabbi. I said, I've never set foot in Hillel in my life. He said, well, that wouldn't, that's not a problem either. They want something new and different. I said, I'm Orthodox. He said, well, we'll see what can happen with that. I said, where's it based? They said, Washington, D.C. I said, I love Washington, but I'm not going to uproot the family. Thank you very much. I went home, told Esther. She said, you're going for an interview. I said, no, I'm not, sweetheart. We have a wonderful life here. She said, yes, we have a wonderful life here. So we'll be able to have two wonderful lives. I said, sweetheart, I'm not going to, get the whole family uprooted and do all of that. She said, there are enough good Jewish lawyers, go for an interview. So she literally forced me to fly to Washington for an interview. And that always happens when you're not interested in the job gets offered to you. And literally Esther made me do it. There's no question that on a kind of profound level, I saw this as an opportunity of a lifetime, but not worth disrupting the most important life I had.
Right.
So we moved at the age of 38. We moved to Silver Spring. I had no idea what I was in for. Hillel was not in a good place at that time, and yet I thought it was one of the most important enterprises in the world, particularly if without Jewish identity that's based on both knowledge and nobility, then the Jewish people don't go on. And here was, 80% of the non-Orthodox students in the world, maybe 90 in the United States, were on the same 100 campuses where there were Hillels. Right. And if that could be an opportunity for students to go through 4 years saying, this Jew stuff matters to me, that would be all you can hope for. So we spent I generally have a klal that I don't think you should take a major leadership job for more than 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So my klal was, we will do this for 10 years and we'll see what's next. So of course I stayed for 15. Just because it wasn't done. You had to keep doing it. And then I was approached by Yeshiva when, along with every other modern Orthodox Jew, I think, in public service, when Dr. Lamb announced that he was going to retire. They asked me. I told them I'm neither a great sage nor a Rav, and they said, "No, well, come on anyway." I said, "Thanks very much." I said no 3 times, and they went away. Unfortunately, they did not have a successful search process, and 2 years later, they disbanded their search committee and said, "Well, let's get the person who's going to be president." Wow. And they called me, and I said, "I have the best job in Jewish America. I'm about to open our international headquarters. I love Yeshiva University, but I think the presidency would kill me. And I don't have any of your bona fides." So I said, no. The gentleman called me again 3 days later and really started arguing with me. And I said, I've seen what you've done with your candidates. They get splashed all over the papers. They get beaten up. I said, I won't be a candidate. He said, we're not talking about being a candidate. We're talking about you doing due diligence. I said, you know what? I'm sorry. Thank you, no. And the man said, are you really prepared to tell me that there is no chance in the world that you would accept the presidency of Yeshiva University? I said, well, I'm not so arrogant as to say that. They said, well, what chance would there be? I said, there's a 1% chance. He said, when can we have lunch? Wow. And that I had lunch with him. His name was Lou Bravmann. May he rest in peace. Sure. I know him. Who was just kind of persuasive. And Ronald Stanton, may he rest in peace, who was the chairman of the board. We had lunch at my most favorite dessert, and it was a Wednesday matinee, so there were 100 women there in the place. I'm sure they couldn't hear a word I said. And ultimately, I said no. Stanton drove me back to my hotel and asked if I would help mentor the person they chose. I said, sure. I called my wife and said, we dodged the bullet, sweetheart. And then I got a call from Stanton's office with a schedule of the meetings he had set up for me. So that was November 5th. December 5th, I was elected by the Board of Trustees. Wow. Okay, before we're going to open that up in a minute in terms of your tenure at YU, but before we even get there, I want to do 2 follow-ups on things you mentioned. 2 things that struck me that I'd love to hear your insight on. One is
mentors, right? You spoke about when you were transitioning from Cardoza to Hillel. So you spoke to mentors. You said, one of them told you the only route really is lay leadership, etc. I'd love to just hear your thoughts on, you serve as a mentor to many in your current role as president emeritus. Just I want to hear your thinking just in terms of the importance of having mentors throughout one's professional evolution and career, and how you seek out mentors, and how one finds good mentors.
I don't know that I'm great at it. I think I believe in Pirkei Avos saying "Aseh lecha rav u'kanei lecha chaver," and I think a mentor is a combination of that. Make for yourself, choose a rav, a rabbi, and invest in a friend. And I think that a mentor is a combination of those. Not someone who you want to be when you grow up, but someone who can give you perspective and wisdom and knows how to listen and encourage. And I don't think I think my classic mentors were my parents, and certainly my wife serves that role. She's a psychologist, and for the last several years she's only had one client, and very important. If there was ever a crisis or a problem at YU, I had the same rule. I would immediately make 2 phone calls. One was to my wife, and the other was to the chairman of the board, because I never wanted to be in it alone. And I thought that was my responsibility. Look, I think mentors, the major purpose of having a mentor is someone who can understand and ask you questions that help you decide the path you want to take. I think as you get older and you've had more experience in different areas, so you can lend your expertise to them when they ask questions. But you can't make yourself someone's mentor. You have to turn to you that way. And I'm very fortunate that I have a broad enough circle that from time to time I can be helpful.
Interesting. But even when you were younger, it seems like you did, in fact, you did seek out mentors. You understood and appreciated the importance of that in the professional world, like when you were in your 30s.
I think in the world bichlal. I mean, I think that my rabbi and my cantor were my teachers, but basically it was my parents. And in the absence of my father, I think I tended to look to people who could be effective role models, but keeping in mind a very important lesson that my father told me. He said, Richard, you're at the age of 13. He said, you're a very good judge of character, but that's not always good, because you can sometimes see in people things that you don't like and that are bad. So here's my advice. He said, yes, look to the bad and look to the good, but then relate to the good. And I think that's helped me in wonderful stead through my life.
Okay. And the other thing,
by the way, just parenthetically,
yeah.
One of the things that's really problematic of remote work is that you're basically, except for the virtual, you're basically isolated. And if you're a young person in a firm, you can't look to see, who do you want to emulate? Who do you want to be close to? Who do you want to build bonds? Who are you learning from? And that's why I certainly think that although there can be a little bit more flexibility in work, I would not be the most supportive of having a remote workplace.
I hear. The other thing I wanted to ask was that you alluded to it very, kind of, you went by it quickly, but I want to extrapolate something from it. You mentioned that when you assumed the role at Hillel, there were challenges. Like there was work to be done. Let's say it like that. And I find often when I look around the Jewish communal landscape, it's interesting. On the one hand, there are opportunities for growth. I see many of my counterparts and friends have assumed leadership roles, but interestingly to me, many times when they assume those positions, they're assuming positions that maybe are prominent or have some prominence, but on the one hand, it's attractive because there's a lot of upward, there's a lot to do to accomplish. But on the other hand, it's interesting that often these organizations, but I'm not talking about Hillel in particular, I'm just talking in general, there are many organizations that need tipul, we'll say, that need great leadership. It's just interesting to me. It's just an observation. This is not the first time I've heard somebody reference taking over something and building it into something, but when they got it, it wasn't exactly what it maybe should have been. I wonder if you've seen that, if you've observed that.
Sure. Look, even in healthy organizations, the leadership gurus say that the only constant in life is change. that a manager spends her or his time dealing with complexity, a leader deals with change. And so that's always there. I also teach my students in my leadership classes that I have two definitions of what leadership means. The first one I think is profoundly Jewish, and that's a leader is someone who takes responsibility. I think our definition of being a Jew is someone who steps forward from the time that Moshe Rabbeinu, Vayifen Kovacho Vayarki Einish, he saw there was no one there, and he smote, I like saying smote, he smote the Egyptian to save the Hebrew slave. And our whole story is not so much from slavery to freedom, it's from victimhood to responsibility. And I think that's very important. And so one definition of leadership is somebody who takes responsibility, which is why every grandparent can say that their grandchild is a leader if they take responsibility. The other definition is that leadership is a vision and an implementation strategy. That it can't be just a strategy of what you're going to do, and it can't just be a disassociated vision. It has to be both together. And I think that, to me, has held me in good stead in my opportunities where I was a steward of an institution.
And how do you know when something is too much, like, not to go somewhere, like it's too messy or it's too complicated, or no, that contradicts what you said, like you take responsibility, you jump in, you believe in yourself, you'll make it better.
I did a lot of due diligence in terms of Hillel, and I saw that there were a bunch of really wonderful people, but they were kind of stuck. And too much, it was the synagogue on campus, and that was the last thing that most Jewish students wanted. I also saw that there was a disconnect between, in those days, B'nai B'rith, which supported Hillel, and what Hillel wanted. But I didn't know the extent of the financial and leadership issues. I would tell you that I did have a sense in both of my leadership positions. I did have a sense of what it should be. I don't think I knew all the details at all or what I was going to do, but I did have a sense of where we wanted to go, not necessarily how to go there.
Mm-hmm.
And for that, you need to take in partners. You need to rely on people who are wise. In terms of Jewish leadership, I had a few people I looked to as people that I kind of looked up to, and they were kind enough to befriend me. Malcolm Hoenlein was one, is one. Abe Foxman from ADL was another. And interestingly, Barry Schrage, who was the Federation executive in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
And they were extremely helpful and continue till this day. In the presidency, presidents don't have a lot of time to hang out with other presidents unless it's a just sit there job. But usually the presidencies are not that. It's usually unpacking your clothes and then repacking them to leave. But these days, but I was befriended by the wonderful John Sexton, who was president of NYU, and by Father Joe McShane at Fordham, by Larry Bacco at the Tufts, and by Yehuda Reinhardt at Brandeis, and Steve Trachtenberg at George Washington. They were just wise people. And when I was becoming president, I spent a day following around a few of them just to see what their day was like. And you do find the generosity of people is something you learn from.
So I want to ask you this question many years ago, last time we were together, which was at the Champions Gate conference, which was,
oh my gosh,
already when you were pivoting out and they were looking for your successor. But I did ask you a question about kind of fundraising, and I think fundraising is, I think you just alluded to it in terms of packing and unpacking on some level, and certainly it's something you probably did, at Hillel and certainly at Yeshiva. And we have a lot of so Jewish Philanthropy podcast. So we have philanthropists who listen and who are our guests. We have professional fundraisers who listen. So I'd love to hear, you are one of the better people of the space, whether you like that compliment or not, but I'd like to hear some of your insights just in terms of how to be effective in soliciting partners and getting people excited about vision and mission.
I once heard from a solicitor from a national Jewish agency. He was training a group of volunteers. And he said, you have to know that the most important thing is to develop your own sense of personal integrity. And once you learn how to fake that, but I gave much too little thought in my career to the fact that I'd have to be engaged in revenue generation. Right? I saw a little bit of go on when I was at Cardozo, and
in Cardozo, were you involved in this space?
well, not formally. I was the COO, so I worked with the board. I developed a friendship with the board chairman, the late Jacob Burns. Since I taught legal ethics and he was an ethicist, he liked me, and in fact, he gave me my first major gift to Hillel. I was such a good fundraiser. I didn't ask him when I met him after I took the job. He said, "Well, aren't you supposed to raise money?" I said, "Well, yes." He says, "Well, you haven't asked me for anything." I said, "Would you like me to?" He said, "Sure, give me a proposal." So I went back to Washington and I thought about what he loved and what we needed, and I wrote a proposal for the Jacob Burns Endowment in Ethics, saying I would give out grants to different campuses. I also knew that my influence would come if I was a source of funds for particular purposes. I could move it, and I put together a proposal for $1 million gift endowment for ethics, and I sent it to him. And the next time I went to see him, he said, "Well, I got your proposal." I said, "Oh, that's very nice." He says, "Yes, I really like it. Let's do it." I said, "Well, that's great, Mr. Burns. Did you have any particular figure in mind?" And he looked down at the paper and he said, "Well, you said $1 million." I said, "Yeah." And that was my first great victory. We got $1 million. It was the largest, not only gift that Hillel ever had, it was the largest gift that B'nai B'rith ever got. And that gave me a not well-earned reputation. And so in terms of philanthropy, I mean, I think if you're doing something for a purpose and you're looking for impact, so among the things you have to do is take in partners, professional partners and lay partners. I also am infamous for coining the phrase that the Jewish community needs Klei Kodesh and Lay Kodesh. But I think you have to view it as a partnership. You have to view the people not as donors, frankly, as investors. I think you have to show them investment opportunities, and you have to also show them that there's an ROI, there's a return on the investment. And therefore, what I thought the job was to tell the story, was to try to get people immersed in the product. It was fairly successful. I mean, I trained a lot of people. There was a lot of money. I mean, Hillel went from being a $12 million national enterprise to, I think now it's $100 million global enterprise. But in 15 years, when I left, it had a budget of $70 million. So it also helps that you have to believe that siyata d'shmaya or destiny plays a role. When I was at Hillel, literally God delivered into my hands Edgar Bronfman, who was kind of the king of the Jews in those days. And it put us on a place where we could move forward. And we all worked very hard. But if I would tell you that when I started the position, I knew how to do this or what to do, I said, how can we possibly do this? Yeshiva University was daunting for other reasons. But it still comes down, and I didn't mention the other thing. It's really important to have a relationship with the people. It doesn't mean you got to be buddies. And the truth of the matter is, like in corporate life and in philanthropic life, your balabatim hopefully are your friends, but you have to realize it's a transactional friendship. And when the transaction leaves, it doesn't mean the friendship goes away. You're just in a different place. So, I could tell you, I was given a gift of $100 million by the chairman, Ron Stanton. And I told him it was the largest. I proposed that he give the largest gift in the Jewish world, and that it would provoke other people to give such gifts. That was 2006, when we thought it all could be, before the Great Recession and before the markets collapsed in 2008, and before Madoff entered our lives. But I wrote him a proposal, and I told him I would. And it was basically to create a fund that I could use to start new things at yeshiva. And when we'd get donors to subsidize those things, I could return money to the corpus. And I went up to see him, and he said, "I like what you're saying." I said, "So what do you have in mind?" He said, "So let's do it." So that was the great skill that I used.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. I think it's important. How much do you think it matters the title or the role of the, I don't call it the solicitor, even the friend, the person who's the intermediary who gets to facilitate the gift? Does it, I imagine being in a position of CEO of Hillel International, president of Yeshiva University, there's a certain oomph that comes with that. Again, not that you're taking that personally, that you're, it's not about you personally, but
Right.
you know, it's a position, right? So versus people who have lesser roles, who are tasked with similar. What do you tell somebody who doesn't maybe have that same panache, let's say, or same what's the word I'm looking for?
Position.
But the same entry point,
Yeah. Look, I think what's most important is, again, that you are someone that someone likes to be a part of, and that you can tell the story well and with passion, and also can relate from a business perspective about saying, you know, I'm not looking to you for charity. I'm looking for you to make a philanthropic investment,
Right.
so that your money can work as you would like it to do. There is no question that to get a major gift, you have to be a person of status and stature within the institution. You
Right.
know, whether that's someone with the title of vice president for advancement who is involved. I mean, it's very important for them to think they don't just go down a list of donors and say, "Okay, check it," or it's a phonathon. It's important at a phonathon that someone be friendly and nice and say, "I'm involved with Yeshiva University." And frankly, if I ever find out that I'm talking to someone on the phone who's a paid fundraiser who's just doing it for organization X, they don't get my support. I think there are a lot of people. I'll talk about both institutions, but YU more, because YU was there before me. I think the presidency is a global position that brings with it its sense of stature, and it's your opportunity to fill it in a way that's meaningful. That's true with fundraising. It's also true with the development of the program and the impact on the students. It's a whole.
Right. No, 100%, 100%. What would you say was the greatest privilege of the 15-year tenure at Yeshiva? And what was, I mean, I guess Madoff was the greatest challenge, but maybe it was something else. I don't even know. You know, what would you say?
Look, one of the things I learned is that God in his wisdom doesn't necessarily put you in a position for particular achievements. In some ways, God puts you in a position to be able to handle the crises that you don't anticipate. And any university presidency, then as well as today, is incredibly complicated. And you have, I mean, thank God that Madoff comes to mind, because there were so many others. And you had to deal with them and not get pulled down by them. The greatest privilege, never in my life did I think I would be president of Yeshiva University.
I think it's the type of gig where nobody thinks they're going to be.
I thought it was not possible. But I also have to tell you, when I was 12, just 13, Yeshiva had started a new program, the creation of an extraordinary gentleman named Rabbi Herbert Dobrinsky, who
Sure.
spent his life doing what you were talking about at Yeshiva. But he invented something called the B'nai Hillel Honor Society, to reach out to kids in Talmud Torah who they thought were outstanding, and 13-year-old outstanding, and would bring them to YU for a day, and there'd be a big convocation, and etc. And I was chosen, and I remember going for the first time to YU with my mother and my father, and we took a tour of the university. And I remember my father was very moved by it, and it was the first time in my life that I saw him in tears. And as we were standing there, he said, "You know, what a privilege to think that such a place exists. You have to go to high school here." And then he died. So that memory is always with me. So the little B'nai Hillel kid whose father said he should come to high school ended up being responsible for that university. Look, once I had been relatively successful at Hillel, there were an array of opportunities that came my way, including university presidencies, none of which tremendously interested me. Yeshiva is who I am. As Hillel, by the way, was who I am. So what's the privilege? The privilege is the students, is that you get to be a partner with the Rabbanu Shalom and other people of goodwill to advance our world, to model for students. I mean, my phrase describing yeshiva was the role was to ennoble and enable students, right? Enable, give them all the skills to be successful, but ennoble, teaching them that their purpose in life is to be, every day, is to be Mekadesh the Chol, is to make noble the ordinary. And that's the greatest privilege. Was it a privilege for me to meet an extraordinary group of Rosh Yeshiva and Rabbeim? Did I have the incredible zechus of spending several years being mentored by Norman Lamb, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, and not in terms of dealing with the university, but in life ideas. I had the great privilege of being very close to Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, who taught me maybe one of the most important bits of advice I ever got. During one of our crises, we were sitting together and he said, Richard, he says, you know, that the most important thing is to have the respect of people
that you respect. I know
I'd never heard that. And it was and remains profoundly important through the good times and the more challenging times as well. So that was the privilege, but to see these kids, and I must tell you, to walk down the street today, which I never thought would happen, and have people just stop me and say, excuse me, President Joel, let me introduce myself, and I want to say thank you.
That's beautiful.
Or by the way, from Hillel or from YU. It's a bonus that I had no idea I could have.
Beautiful. So as we wind down, I want to ask you two final questions, and then obviously any follow-up or final remarks. October 7th, obviously, is, very much in our hearts, on our minds. We've all been touched. We've all been changed. We've all been activated. We talked a little bit, just for me, Ani Akatan, little me, the reason why I taught this past semester at YU was because I wanted to do something on a college campus that thankfully is incredibly supportive of Jewish students. Right. But we all want to do more. I'd love to hear a little bit where you are on October 7th, what your thinking is, and just kind of how you've been proceeding through the last number of really terrible, trying months for our people.
Yeah. Look, the pain is great. I have a daughter living in Jerusalem. I have three nephews now in the army, two of them in Gaza. And they're all our family. I think the overwhelming issue I had that took me a while to get there is the very harsh reality. I had convinced myself during my Hillel years that anti-Semitism was tremendously on the wane, and that and in fact I felt that Edgar Bronfman once told me when he became head of the World Jewish Congress, he had a meeting with Rav Soloveitchik. And he said to the Rav, I've become the president of the World Jewish Congress, was wondering if you had any guidance for me. And he said that the Rav turned to him and said, Mr. Bronfman, I'd like you to always remember that the Jewish people were created for more than just fighting anti-Semitism. And that's been with me a lot. I mean, I think we made a terrible mistake with American Jewry, and we defined our identity as the anti-Semites are coming to get us, or the Holocaust, they killed 1 out of 3 Jews, or little Israel is a besieged place flowering in the desert with nothing else. And we lost at least one generation that way. None of the knowledge and the experience and the basis and the beauty and the purpose. So
I like to say, like, Sor Me'Rava Aseh Tov, right? The emphasis could be.
That's correct. But Aseh Tov has to be strong there. And so I didn't relate a lot to the anti-Semitism. We did what we had to do on campus, but you know what? I learned on October 7th was the Esav Sonayas Yaakov, that there is ingrained in our society, not just America, but globally and over time, this vitriolic anti-Semitism. Perhaps because we are ha'ivri, because we are always the other, because at best we want to be a part of a community and apart from the community, that we're all, and then there's jealousy, and maybe occasionally we do things wrong, but this kind of visceral and virulent anti-Semitism Again, my friend Jonathan Sachs said, in this generation, anti-Semitism manifests itself as anti-Zionism. And so on October 7th, it was in my face that Esav Sonais Yaakov, that anti-Semitism is something that gets unleashed. I certainly think the last years in America, some misbegotten leadership basically gave permission to be uncivil. Incivility reigns. I think the notion of anger and hatred is afoot in the land and in the world,
Right.
along with the populism that we see. So it's a very hard thing. I think the other reality is there were a few thousand years where we existed without the state of Israel. The Jewish people cannot exist without the state of Israel. And it's a global challenge that has to be met. The other thing is, and you learn this from campus, but you don't have to look on campus. Ignorance is steering the world. And I teach my students that if there are two critical words to a university education, it's the words complexity and nuance. And nothing in life today particularly can be understood. If someone complains to you about Israel and what about this? And you say, you have to understand, it's complicated. You've lost. You've lost. So we have to raise people with an understanding of complexity and nuance. And we also realize we have to be very strong and very assertive, but never forget that our purpose is still to bring nobility and goodness into the world and to model it and to be an Or LaGoyim. And that's hard. It's still about that. I think if there's one last thing, weakness is not a virtue. And it's not a value. And for me, a master principle was when Isaac gave the blessing to Yaakov. And when Jacob and Esav came forward and Rivka told Jacob to fool his father and to put on fake clothing and to prepare the food so he could steal the blessing.
Right.
And Isaac went ahead and gave him the blessing. So I always say to myself, who are we kidding? If you see someone and the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the arms are the voice of Esav, what do you think is real? Why would he think that this must be Esav? So I think Yaakov knew much more than that. And he knew that it was a tough thing to give the Jewish people leadership that would be complex and nuanced. And when he saw that Jacob, the Ishtam, the simple, pure guy, had Hakol Kol Yaakov, yes, that's Yaakov's voice, the Hayodayim Yedei Esav, but you're able to use the strength of Esav, you're the person who has to lead. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind.
Interesting. Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to ask one final question, if I may.
Sure.
And I actually just got a hold of a book recently. It's about 7 former presidents of the United States and what they did post their presidency.
Yeah, Jared Cohn's book, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So it's actually something very, very, very profound to think about. You know, I can't imagine that must be, I mean, we see what Trump is doing now, but I'm saying, but like, that's like, you know, most people, they ride into the night, into the sunset. And then, so I think it's relevant, obviously, to somebody like yourself to be kind of at the helm, the leadership pinnacle of the modern Orthodox Jewish world. And then obviously still quite influential in teaching and doing a myriad of amazing, impactful things. But obviously, we can't stay in that role forever, and we have to let other people have their chance, so on and so forth. I'm curious kind of what you'd be willing to share in terms of what that's like emotionally, the pivot, the transition, lessons learned.
I will tell you that Baruch atah b'voecha, Baruch atah b'tzeisecha is very important. You have to leave as a blessing, just as you come as a blessing. And also, you're very fortunate if you get to determine when that time was. You know, I had an open kind of commitment at Yeshiva. There was nothing there, except I did say I'd stay for 10 years. And at 10 years, everybody said to me, and I said to myself, we're in the middle of crisis X, and there are more things to do. So I told the trustees I would stay on until X crisis was solved, and then I asked them to look for someone else. So I had the 15-year contract. I was there for 14 years, or my last contract. And I think it's very important to say, now I'm done. Also, unless you are an egomaniac, nobody can think that you're the only person who can do a job. You have your particular job to do. You need to put your imprint on. It's also vanity to think you're going to create something that's going to last for the ages. You're going to create something, pieces of which or ideas of which can last for the ages. And being in education, the great benefit is it lasts not necessarily in the institution, but in the people that you've had interaction with. You know, in terms of leaving, people would come up to me and say, or to Esther, and say, you know, do you miss it? Would you want to do it again? And here's my answer. My answer was, you know, Esther and I would do this again in a minute. We just don't want to do it anymore. Thomas Jefferson defined the presidency as a splendid misery. And that's about the country, but it's also true certainly about institutional leadership and certainly with dealing with, God bless us, the Jewish people. And there's a time when you need to say, this is enough. This is enough. I think both my tenures were cherished things, but I'll also tell you that yeshiva, even more than Hillel, the word that applied was it was relentless. It had no day and it had no night. It had 24/7, not 24/6. And you felt you were owned by everybody, which is a zechus.
Sure.
But it's also an incredible burden. So the moment I stepped down, Esther said she saw an anvil come off my shoulders.
Right. Wow.
So certainly there are adjustments. You know, people joked at a Purim spiel that the day after I was president, I woke up, I got dressed, I went out of my house, I walked into the presidential limo in the back seat, and nothing happened. I did have a sabbatical. I would tell you that there is some interesting adjustment. It's also the first time this parting was the first time I wasn't going from something to something else.
Right.
But the teaching is important. But more than that, I spend every day with my best friend. We have children in 4 different locations around the world. And thank God there are people who I speak to and who speak to me, and occasionally I can even voice my opinion. This is the totality of a life, and I'm not winding down. This is the next chapter.
Right. What would you say is the biggest difference from your vantage point of the role that President Bravmann is playing or has to play today versus kind of in the juncture of time that you were operating? What would you say is the biggest difference for, it doesn't have to be President Bravmann, it could be, you know, university presidents today at large. What do you see from your vantage point is the biggest difference operating today, 2024?
Well, look, first of all, there is a difference between Yeshiva University and almost any other place, maybe not some of the other faith-based institutions, but this is, Jonathan Sachs called this the most important Jewish institution outside the state of Israel. And so there is a consuming sense of purpose and responsibility. University presidencies in the period of time have become even harder because of social media, because of the accessibility of lies and falsehoods that a community, including our community, feeds upon. And as president of YU, and I'm sure it's the same for Rabbi Bravmann, you are responsible for everyone. And everybody thinks that they are stakeholders. And that's a blessing, but it's also a curse. Everybody wants to tell you what to do. That being surrounded by it was always difficult. I think I don't presume to say how it is for Ari Bravmann. I think I got to be president at a time of going to the next place for yeshiva, making the student enterprise the center of it, and getting to talk about nobility. I did my part in terms of geopolitics, but I was very careful not to make myself a spokesman for the Jewish people. Times might be different now. And certainly I wish my successor and all to come from that. I mean, we're a small group. And at commencement, it's particularly lonely to see that I'm the only living president emeritus. What we're doing is critically important and has to continue. And Klal Yisrael has been created, you know, not to fight anti-Semitism. We've been created to share a message from the Rabbanu Shalom of how to live a life of purpose and meaning.
Right.
And that
I'll
remains.
let you go, but I'm going to just ask one follow-up quick things also. Just a little advice. How do you, when one is in such a all-encompassing role, what are some of your tips for how to manage that level of scrutiny? Let's say it like that.
Well, to have the best wife in the world helps.
I've heard that as a theme throughout. Okay.
But it's true. But it's true. And to take the job seriously, but don't take yourself seriously. And once a year, Esther and I would take what we called a no Jews cruise. We went on a 1-week cruise just with Esther and me and the Rabboni Shalom, not chas v'shalom a kosher cruise. If I saw someone who looked Jewish, I turned the other way. It was to sit on a mirpeset and to say Magadnu Masecha Hashem and to get yourself together. We made, I don't think it was a mistake, but during my 15 years, we had over 1,500 students for Shabbos.
Wow.
But that means that Shabbos, I was either there or we were out speaking, or we didn't have that kind of a life. But between my children and grandchildren and us and good friends, you just took a lot of deep breaths. And occasionally Esther would remind me that in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And I did have on my desk this statement. Do I have it here? I don't have it in. I had a 2-sided frame, right? One said from Tehillim, we are created kima'at kelohim. We are just slightly lower than the angels. And the other says that remember that we are afar va'efer, that we're nothing but dust.
Right.
And when you're in a position of that responsibility, how critical to be able to know that every day.
Right. Very nice. Thank you so much, President Joel, for making the time, sharing these profound insights. I'm very much looking forward to sharing this with our audience. So
I think your audience will get a really fine 1-hour nap.
I doubt it, but thank you.
It's a pleasure, Rabbi.